Welcome to our lesson on Spartan government, where we look at the leadership and social structure of Sparta. Our objectives. We're going to identify the system of government in Sparta. We're going to identify the unique features of Spartan government in Greece. And we're going to be able to explain why Sparta needed two kings. Our first thing we're going to look at, though, are the Helots. They were Sparta's problem. In order to maintain these really excellent warriors, Sparta enslaved all of the farmers in the Peloponnese, or around their city-state. And they outnumbered the Spartans a great deal. And they always feared that these people would uprise and take over the country. So fearing this, Spartan boys would always spy on the Helots and attack them at night and keep them scared. And there was always an army campaigning the countryside. So we have to imagine what their culture was like. Imagine a world where every job is to support the army. So everyone out there worked to keep the soldiers strong and in the field and fighting. So that's what Sparta was. It was a society built around war. So what was Spartan government like then? How did it maintain itself? They had kings. They had a group called the Gerousia, which we'll get to next. They had an assembly, and they had these men called ephors. These four groups are what made up the Spartan government. Now the two kings, the way it worked was, one king would govern at home for a year. He'd be in charge of keeping everything in place. And the second king would lead the army for another year. So a 2-year term, you'd be chosen from the aristocrats or the oligarchy, and one king would run the country, one king would fight. And this kept the Helots and the enemies of Sparta away because they always had a war or had an army going. This kept Sparta safe because they always had an army ready to go. Now the Gerousia, they were the people who did the day-to-day running of things. It was a council of 30 men. They had to be older than 60. The Spartans believed that older men were wiser. They elected the kings, and they made the laws. So that leads us to our first shout-out. Why did Sparta need two kings? Pause the video and think for a moment. They had one to rule and one to fight the Helots and enemies. So one to rule, one to fight. Now the assembly. While laws were made by the Gerousia, the assembly voted on all the laws. So in this case, any man over the age of 30 who was a citizen, so a real Spartan, could vote. So they were a little more democratic when it came to choosing their laws. And finally, they had the ephors. These 5 men would follow the king around, and their job was to make sure the king did not become corrupt. They had this fear that Spartan kings, when they leave Sparta, they become influenced by other countries and maybe take money from them and give up the Spartan way. So their job was to make sure that the king was being a true Spartan. If he wasn't, they'd report home and they'd replace the king. So a very important job. They were like the king's chaperones. Now, your next shout out. What were the ephors? Pause the video for a moment and write. They were 5 men in charge of watching the king and making sure he did his job. So finally for homework, why did Sparta need 2 kings? Think about that and think about what I discussed in this video, and that concludes our lesson.